When the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign blinked off, Margaret Andrews smiled softly to herself. She had been looking forward to this visit for weeks, finally seeing her only son, David, after nearly a year apart. She imagined him waiting just outside the terminal, arms open, maybe even holding one of those silly signs with her name on it. But when she stepped into the arrival hall, there was no one. Just the buzz of strangers and the cold white glow of airport fluorescents. No familiar voice. No smile calling out, "Mom." The only thing that greeted her was the sharp bite of winter air and a silence so heavy it echoed in her bones. She waited near the pickup zone, her small suitcase standing by her side. She glanced at her phone. No missed calls, no messages. Maybe traffic, she told herself. Maybe he's circling the terminal. But 30 minutes passed. Then 40. Still nothing. Her hand trembled slightly as she called him. 4 rings, then voicemail. "Hey, it's David. Leave a message." She didn't. Instead, she lowered the phone, slipped it into her coat pocket, and looked up at the thick falling snow outside. Somewhere deep inside her chest, something cracked quietly. It wasn't just disappointment. It was something colder: recognition. David wasn't late. He wasn't coming. The taxi driver barely made eye contact as she climbed into the back seat. "Where to, ma'am?" She gave him the address without thinking. The same address she had lived at for over 30 years. The same house David had grown up in. The same place he hadn't bothered to visit this Christmas. Outside, the city shimmered with holiday lights and cheerful windows. But in the back of that cab, Margaret sat in silence. Her fingers curled tightly in her lap, her breath fogging the glass. She wasn't sad. Not yet. She was processing. And somewhere between the airport and home, something in her began to shift. This wasn't confusion. It was clarity. Back home, Margaret sat quietly at the edge of her bed, the same floral comforter she had folded and unfolded for years now bunched beneath her hands. The suitcase lay unopened on the floor. She didn't move to unpack. Not yet. Her mind drifted not to the airport, but to years long past. After her husband died suddenly, when David was just 8, Margaret had tightened her world around her son like a protective shell. She'd skipped meals to make sure he ate well, picked up extra shifts at the clinic, just to cover school trips he never thanked her for. When David struggled in math, she found a tutor. When he broke his arm skateboarding, she stayed overnight in a hospital chair, humming lullabies he pretended not to hear. At 23, David had come to her with a dream in his eyes and a startup pitch in his hand. "Just need a little seed money, Mom," he had said, eyes bright. Margaret had smiled and signed the check, pulling from her early retirement savings. When the bank manager warned her it might not be a wise choice, she'd only replied, "Dreamers need wings." The app failed. Investors disappeared. David spiraled. And still, Margaret stayed. "We'll find another way," she told him, holding him through the quiet sobs he thought she couldn't hear. That was 10 years ago. Since then, she had co-signed loans, paid off credit cards, even refinanced her house once when his business hit a rough patch. She wore the same winter coat for 7 years because there was always a new bill to cover. She skipped her own 60th birthday because David had forgotten to plan anything. And yet, not once did she complain. She called it love. He called it normal. Now, sitting in the quiet of her own bedroom, Margaret felt something strange wash over her, not regret, but a slow burning awareness. She had spent decades being the net that caught him every time he fell. But what happens when the net decides not to catch you anymore? What happens when loyalty is mistaken for obligation? And when the obligation breaks, what's left? For the first time in a very long time, Margaret wasn't sure who she had been giving all of herself to. Or why. The next morning, the sun filtered faintly through the blinds, casting long pale lines across the kitchen tiles. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and opened her phone without thinking. It had become routine over the years, checking balances, transferring funds, making sure David's automatic payments had gone through. Only this time, her thumb hovered just a little longer over his name. David Andrews. Still listed as a secondary user on 3 bank accounts, still holding a joint credit card, still marked as her emergency contact. Emergency. The word made her pause. What kind of emergency leaves your mother standing alone at an airport curb? She tapped into the account settings. Her breath was steady, her face calm. No dramatics, no anger. Just numbers. Just facts. She scrolled to the control panel. A small button sat at the bottom of the screen. Freeze access. She clicked it. A prompt appeared. Confirm action? Her finger didn't hesitate. Yes. The screen blinked once. Then again. Access suspended pending authorization renewal. And just like that, he was out. His debit card would fail. His auto payments would bounce. The accounts he had used like personal piggy banks were no longer his to touch. Margaret set the phone down and exhaled slowly. It felt nothing like revenge. It felt like finally remembering her own name. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the chipped paint on the ceiling she'd always meant to fix. Somewhere across town, David was probably sipping an expensive coffee, planning a dinner with Tina, unaware that the ground beneath his lifestyle had just vanished. And for once, Margaret didn't feel guilty about it. This wasn't an outburst. It wasn't punishment. It was a quiet correction. A boundary. Drawn not in anger but in survival. It was, in every way that mattered, the beginning of something new. Barely an hour passed before her phone buzzed. Margaret glanced at the screen. It was a text from David. "Mom, your account's glitching. My card's not working. Can you check?" No greeting. No apology. Just an assumption that she would drop everything and fix it. She stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Old instincts stirred the need to smooth, to explain, to reassure. But they didn't take hold the way they used to. Instead, a different memory surfaced. 5 years ago, a hospital room, Margaret in a gown, pale and groggy after surgery, tubes in her arms, a nurse checking vitals every hour. She had told David about the operation weeks in advance. He promised he'd come. He never showed. Work emergency, he had said later over the phone, as if it had been a dentist appointment, as if her pain was optional. Margaret never forgot the feeling of waking up alone, scanning the hallway for her son, only to realize she wasn't important enough to be a priority. Now, as her phone buzzed again with a second message, "Mom." "Hello?" She simply turned it over, screen down. No response. No explanation. No drama. Just silence. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any confrontation. She stood, walked to her study, and opened the desk drawer where she kept her personal files. Medical directives, living will, emergency contact forms, all with David's name carefully filled in. She pulled each one out and laid them flat on the desk. One by one, she began to update them. New contact, a trusted friend from church. New medical proxy, not family. New beneficiary, a split between women's charities and senior legal aid. It was the first time her name had stood alone on official paperwork since she was 22 years old. And it felt like breathing. Margaret didn't slam any doors. She didn't scream into the void. She simply stopped answering. Because the most powerful form of rejection isn't rage. It's indifference. It didn't take long for David and Tina to go public. A few days after the silence began, Margaret's name started appearing in posts she hadn't been tagged in cryptic complaints, half-truths dressed as pity. Tina posted first. Some people forget who was always there for them. Sad how money changes hearts. The comments poured in. Praying for you guys. Hope she comes to her senses. Elder abuse is real. Margaret read every word in silence, sipping her tea. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Instead, she took screenshots. Every post, every comment, every subtle accusation. Her lawyer, Ms. Carter, had told her once, never interrupt a liar when they're building your case for you. So Margaret didn't. She saved the evidence, organized it by date, and kept it in a private folder labeled, just in case. Eleanor, her friend from the church group, stopped by one afternoon with a bottle of wine and a sharp smile. "You see what Tina's writing?" she asked, sliding her phone across the table. Margaret nodded. "I saw." "You gonna respond?" "No." "You gonna strike back?" Margaret's smile was quiet. Not yet. Because she understood something David and Tina never would. Power doesn't come from who yells the loudest. It comes from who holds the receipts. And Margaret had all of them. The texts. The bank statements. The threats Tina had once sent, thinking Margaret would never push back. She let them keep posting. Let them gather sympathy from strangers who didn't know the full story. Because the truth doesn't need applause to be true. It just needs time. And Margaret had waited a long time already. A few more days of silence wouldn't hurt. Especially when she knew the storm wasn't coming for her. It was coming for them. The summons came on a Thursday morning, folded neatly in an envelope slid beneath her front door. David and Tina were suing her. The allegations were bold and cruel: financial incompetence, mental decline, undue influence. They claimed she was being manipulated, that she was unfit to manage her own money. Margaret read the document once. Then she picked up the phone and called Ms. Carter. A week later, she walked into the courthouse wearing a slate gray pantsuit and soft pearl earrings. Her hair was pulled back, her face composed. She looked not like a victim but like a witness to her own survival. David sat across the room, eyes low. Tina whispered furiously to their young attorney, who flipped through color-coded folders with frantic energy. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, adjusted her glasses. Case 143. Andrews vs. Andrews, she read aloud. Plaintiffs may proceed. David's lawyer stood, voice shaky. He spoke of confusion, of miscommunication, of a vulnerable woman being taken advantage of by external parties. Margaret remained still. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. When it was her turn, Ms. Carter rose with quiet confidence. "We're not here to speculate," she said, placing a single manila folder on the bench. "We're here to present evidence." She opened the binder and began. Exhibit A, text messages from David requesting funds under false pretenses. Exhibit B, bank statements showing thousands transferred to cover his rent, car, vacations, all without consent. Exhibit C, a voicemail recording of David saying, "She's losing it. Once we get control, we're set for life." The room fell silent. Even the judge leaned back. Then, finally, Margaret spoke. Her voice was soft, steady. "I raised my son alone. I paid his debts. I gave until I had nothing left, but I never gave him permission to treat me like a bank with a heartbeat." A gasp rose from the gallery. The ruling came swift. All claims dismissed. The plaintiffs fined for filing a frivolous suit. Margaret Andrews declared fully competent, fully independent. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply stood, nodded at the judge, and walked out. One step closer to her life. On her terms. The morning after the verdict, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a mug of dark roast coffee and a soft calm in her chest she hadn't felt in years. The silence in the house wasn't heavy anymore. It was hers. By midday, she had logged into her private banking portal and finalized what she'd quietly planned for months. Every asset, every account moved into a trust under her name alone. No successor, no proxy, no loophole. Then she clicked open a listing bookmarked weeks ago, a sun-drenched villa overlooking the coast in a small international town. Secluded, safe, quiet. She bought it without flinching. Not a backup plan. A new beginning. That afternoon, Margaret called Ms. Carter and confirmed the final transfer. Then she packed 2 suitcases, just the essentials. Comfortable linen, 1 photo album, her journal, and the leather folder with every legal document she now controlled. By the end of the week, she was gone. She didn't leave a note. She didn't owe one. The ocean air welcomed her like an old friend as she stepped onto the ferry to the island she now called home. At the resort check-in, a young man in crisp linen offered her a glass of chilled lemonade. "Welcome to Coral Bay Sanctuary, Ms. Andrews." She smiled. This time, the name didn't feel heavy. In the days that followed, Margaret began to bloom in the salt air. She joined sailing lessons, attended local markets, laughed with women who had also survived something hard. And on Wednesday mornings, she taught a workshop called Freedom Finance for women over 60 who had given too much for too long. She didn't lecture. She shared. About pension funds quietly drained. About adult children who blurred the line between need and entitlement. About the power of saying no. Not bitter. Not angry. Just clear. Just done. Her story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation. And each week, more women joined her at that table. Not to be rescued, but to remember they were never helpless. Just unheard. Until now. Back in the city, David was unraveling. At first, it was small things: declined cards, missed mortgage payments, bounced auto transfers. He called the bank in a panic, voice rising with each explanation. "I have access, this must be a mistake." But the voice on the other end was firm. "Your authorization has been revoked, sir. The primary owner has changed the terms." David hung up, hands shaking. He sent a long message to Margaret that night, not an apology, just panic. "Please, Mom, I'm in trouble. Not just financial, legal too. I didn't know things would go this far." But Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she opened his letter, read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a manila envelope labeled "Relevant material, unsolicited confession, possible financial misconduct." Then she mailed it to the Financial Crimes Investigation Bureau. No note, no explanation. Just truth. Used correctly. 2 weeks later, the news broke. David Andrews arrested in connection with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of joint accounts. His mugshot spread across local networks. Margaret saw it by accident on a muted TV screen in a small coastal cafe. She didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She simply turned away and sipped her tea. There had been a time she would have sold her wedding ring to keep him safe. But that time had passed. When you spend your life patching holes someone else keeps ripping open, eventually you learn to put the needle down. Margaret hadn't destroyed David's life. He'd done that himself. All she had done was step aside and stop shielding him from the consequences he worked so hard to create. On the morning of her 70th birthday, Margaret walked alone to the shoreline. No candles, no calls, no noise. Just her and the sea. She wore a light linen dress and carried a single smooth stone in her hand, gray, round, and etched with one word: closure. A gift from Eleanor, wrapped in a nod and a soft whisper: "It's time." The waves were gentle that morning, the sky brushed with gold. As the tide rolled over her ankles, salt kissed an old scar on her foot, one she had almost forgotten. She stood still for a long moment. Then she pulled her arm back and tossed the stone. It errsed once, twice, and vanished beneath the surface. She didn't wait for the splash. She didn't look back. Later that afternoon, she signed the final papers on a long-term residency at the coastal sanctuary. A permanent suite, her name on the door, no strings attached. She placed the signed contract beside her passport. Her life had once been made of reactions to emergencies, to guilt, to someone else's voice. Now, every step was a choice. That evening, Margaret sat on her balcony, watching the horizon soften into lavender. She opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote in steady strokes. "Today I belong only to myself." She underlined it twice. And somewhere across the sea, where the noise of old demands couldn't reach her, Margaret finally exhaled. Not as someone left behind, but as someone who had risen and never looked back.